tell how a company's doing, right? We can look at balance sheets and income statements, just kind of look at what we did right here, but we'd like to kind of see trends over time. Right? So another way that analysts look at companies is to look at trends in time over how their inventory is doing and how their accounts receivable is doing and how their assets are doing over time. So they can create what are called common size balance sheets and income statements in order to see this trends over time. So that's what we're going to do now, is create common size balance sheets and income statements. So let's go to our income statement blank. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to basically, I want to make a copy of this. So I'm going to right click on this, move or copy. I'm going to put it right before this, create a copy. Right? And I'm going to call this now, I'm going to rename it my, just simplicity, common size income statement. And I should have two of these up for viewing here. So here I have my income statement on the right. What happened to my common size income statement? Why isn't it there? Thought I put it over here. Thought I renamed this. Now I did. Okay, so I'm going to call this my common size income statement. And I have that on my left window. And in my right window, I have my income statement, which I called income statement 2. Right? And I want to make these common size income statements. So the single thing you need to remember about common size income statements is we look at all the line items on the income statement as a percentage of sales or revenue. So we look at all the line items on the income statement as a percentage of sales or a percentage of revenue. That's what we mean by a common size income statement. So what does that mean? It means that on my common size income statement that this cell is equal to whatever the sales were this year divided by that same cell again, whatever the sales were that year, same year. So that's sales divided by sales, which is 1, and I want to make that a percentage.
If you just click on the Home tab.
There we go. 100%. And how did I get more? Anyway, I still want this to be a percentage. Right? Well, I can't do what I want to do. It's 100%. So I could then say the cost of goods sold is going to be equal to cost of goods sold here divided by that number. I need more digits. I need more digits. All right, I'm not gonna do it, I'll do it this way. Numbers.
See what cost of goods sold is a percentage of sales? What would cost? 100%. Sorry. Gross profit. Right there, decimal was.
All right, well, I'd prefer this to read 15.58%, but I can't make it do that. So I'm gonna have to settle for 15.58%. Now, you could do each line individually. That'd be a bit tedious, wouldn't it? So is there a way we can do it without having to do each one individually?
Whichever one you want to divide it by. So couldn't you push the, make it fixed of that column and then drag it down?
Right, I can make the denominator, which is the
Yeah.
sales for that year, absolute reference, so then I can just pull the whole thing down, right? So, I'm gonna say that, I'll just do it here. This is gonna be equal to my cost of goods sold. Actually, I should do it at the top one. I'm not gonna do it here, I'm gonna use the sales number. I'll start here. This is equal to my sales divided by my sales again, but I wanna make them absolute. I'm gonna make the denominator always gonna use that absolute. Now, since I've done that, I can pull this down and get those numbers, and if I could just add columns to the right, I'd be good.
Right click,
Right click,
format cells.
format cells,
Percentage is already there, so go up to decimal places. And put how many decimals you want.
there we go, okay, well, thank you. Right. Now, I can do it again for 2013, right? I can do it again for 2013, so this cell is gonna be equal to this, divided by that same cell again, and I'm gonna make it absolute. And I pull this down. And I make the format the same as all of these. Where am I? Format. And you should get those numbers. Does that tell us anything?
His cost of goods sold is pretty high. Seems to
Right.
be
So,
eating up
you
everything.
know, that's 85%, we don't know, right? It depends on the industry that it's in,
True.
right? We could compare that. So this is one of the things you would do, right? You could do this for this company. We can look at it over time for the company, and we can look at it compared to other companies in the industry, right? If other companies in the industry, this number is 75%, then we know that this company is doing something, not about wrong, but they're not handling their cost of goods sold as well as other companies are, right?
Mhm.
In addition, right, it was 83%, 84% here. That's not a big difference, but it's increasing, not decreasing,
Mhm.
right? Interest expense has gone from 1.8 to 1.9, right? So the interest expense is going up, right? We can look at that kind of thing. Right? We'll do the same thing on the balance sheet in just a second. Now, we can do our references in two different ways. And this is where what are called mixed references come in very handy. So if I do $B, $13, that's an absolute reference. If I include this in a calculation, it's always going to use cell B13 to do this calculation. But I can have what's called a mixed reference. $B, well, like I said, a D there, $D13. What does that mean? It means the column is going to be absolute, but the row is going to be relative. Or I could do D $13. Now I have a relative row and a absolute column. Sorry, I said that wrong. Relative row, relative column, and absolute row. Say, well, why do we care? Right? Because rather than doing this twice, right, doing this calculation twice, if I use relative references, if I use mixed references, I only have to do this column once, and then I can pull the whole thing over, and I get exactly what I want. Right? I'll show you what I mean. I did it twice here, so I'm going to clear everything out of here. Clear contents. I'm going to change this cell from being absolute column and absolute row to just absolute row. I'm going to make the column be relative. Right? So doing it that way, when I pull it down, I get the same answers. Right? But because I use the mixed reference, where the column I can pull as a regular reference, I can pull this across to the right and get the answers I got before. I mean, it doesn't save much time if you're only going to do it once, but I only wanted to show you that there are times where mixed references come in handy. This is one of those times. Right? Doesn't save a lot of time, but it saves a little bit of time. Okay, so common size income statements. All the line items are compared to sales. I'll give you a guess on a common size balance sheet. What are we going to compare everything to? Here's my balance sheet. We want to do a common size balance sheet. What would be the natural item on there to compare things to? Total assets. sense to me. So do it. Create a common size balance sheet. You want to compare, you want the percentage of total assets for all of the line items on the balance sheet.
I think it wasn't letting you create a new window because you had more than one cell highlighted.
Oh, you think that was it?
Yeah. I think.
Are there three little colored dots on the top left corner?
Yeah, they're gone now.
Uh-oh, you're in trouble.
Uh,
Press escape.
Escape,
Pull the plug.
Escape.
Top
yeah.
down. All the way down.
You've just moved it onto full screen.
Yeah, well, I hit escape. Will I be able to do this now? All right. This is my common size balance sheet over here, so I'm just gonna say that this cell is equal to $21,860,2347. Look at that. Okay? Sorry about that. It's a little bit awkward. I'm not familiar with this Windows. Everybody see how to do that? Okay, create this common size balance sheet. You do the same thing again at the bottom for liabilities and equities. Everybody get that? Jessica, no? Yes?
Oh, yeah. Well, for the liabilities then, I was just wondering if you would compare that to total assets.
Always to total assets, right?
Okay.
So, you know, I mean, look, as an analyst, you can do whatever you want. I mean, seriously, right? I mean, you know, when you're out there, you can do any kind of calculation. This is why during the internet boom in the late nineties, okay, traditional metrics for revenue and thing for companies that were brand new, they weren't using, so they were, you know, analysts were using clicks, right? They were trying to, you know, how many clicks does this company get, right? And various very non-standard measures. So you can do whatever you want, but traditionally, historically, it's total assets to common size. And again, we only have 2 years here. It would help if you had 5 years, right? Then you could see trends over time. And you would also want to compare it to the industry, right? That would give you more of an idea of what's going on, right? Here, if we just look at inventory, right? Inventory has climbed from 76 to 78%. That suggests, at least in this little bit of data, that they're not handling their inventory very well. Right? All right. So, that's pretty much what this chapter's about. But, I'm going to skip chapter 3, which is the cash budget. Again, not that it's not interesting, but we only have a limited number of weeks here, and there's a lot of things to do. So I want to talk instead about chapter 4, which continues this Elvis EPI company accounting issues, and we want to see, well, is there any other ways that we can analyze how companies are doing? And we want to be able to look at it from an internal perspective and from an external perspective. And the calculations for this are relatively straightforward. They're just this number divided by that number. But understanding what they're telling us is the hard part. So I'm going to spend the last part of class here talking about other ways to look at how we can analyze these companies. If those lights don't come on. I think what I'm going to do is, rather than actually doing the calculations in Excel here, we're going to talk about it, we'll talk about it theoretically tonight, and then we'll do the calculations next week. If you're an analyst, and you are looking at a company from a financial perspective, give me something that you would like to know about. A broad, big picture thing, not one single thing, but sort of big picture wise.
What's their projected growth?
Projected growth, okay, so we could look at growth rates,
Profit.
right? So we want to know how they're doing from a profitability perspective, right? So we have a series of things that are called profitability ratios. So this is chapter 4, right? Profitability ratios. Okay? And we'll talk about what those are in a little bit. What else might we want to know? Big picture wise.
Debt to income ratio.
How much debt they have, right?
Yeah.
Will they carry a lot of debt? Will they carry a little debt? Right? So we want to look at, what's the formal name for these? Make sure I get this right. They are called leverage ratios. Actually, I should define these. Profitability ratios, right? They are just what they said, right? Provide indications how profitable a firm has been over a period of time. Leverage ratios reveal the degree to which debt has been used to finance the firm's assets. Says how much debt has been used to finance the firm's assets. What else do we care about in terms of debt? When a firm takes on debt, what do they got to do? They have to pay it back, but what else do they have to do in the meantime before they pay it back? They have to pay interest. So we want to know, well, can they make their interest payments? Right? Can they make their interest payments? The formal name for can they make their interest payments are called coverage ratios. Again, how do we define this? Coverage ratios. The ability of the firm to pay expenses. What about short-term debt? Does it matter how much short-term debt you have?
Yeah, if it's a lot, then that could hurt an upcoming year.
Right? If it's a lot, it could hurt in the upcoming year. And generally, anybody heard of the term maturity matching, banking industry? Maturity matching, doesn't have to be banking, but it's typically where it's used. Anybody? Maturity matching says that in an ideal world, what you'd like to do is you'd like to match the maturities of your debt to the maturities of your assets. In other words, if you are funding long-term assets, how are you going to fund them? With long-term debt. Right? So if you have an asset that's going to be around for 20 years, you don't want to fund that with one-year debt because you got to keep paying it back every year, right? So if you got a 20-year asset, you fund it with 20-year debt. If you've got a one-year asset, you don't fund a one-year asset with 20-year debt. You fund a one-year asset with one-year debt. That general notion is called maturity matching. So how would you, under the idea of maturity matching, what do we want to do with our short-term debts? How would we like to be able to pay them?
With working capital.
With short-term capital. We don't want to have to use long-term sources of capital to pay off short-term debts, right? So we have a name for that also. These are, what do I call that? Liquidity ratios. Right? Liquidity ratios give the ability of the firm to meet short-term obligations. Measure the ability of the firm to meet short-term obligations. And the final major category are referred to as efficiency ratios. Which is better? Let's say you have a net income of $1,000 and total assets of $10,000 and total assets or $20,000.
10,000.
Right? It's better to be able to use $10,000 worth of assets to generate a net income of $1,000 than it is to use $20,000 worth of assets to generate $1,000 worth of net income. With less money tied up in your assets, you're using your assets more efficiently. Right? So these kind of ratios are called efficiency ratios. You can do them with assets, inventory, accounts receivable, a bunch of different asset ratios, how well we're using assets to turn them into profits. So these are measures how assets are used to produce sales. Not to produce sales, to produce profits. These can also be called asset management ratios. Okay. So efficiency ratios or asset management ratios tell us how well the firm's assets are being used to produce sales. We have profitability ratios. Leverage ratios are about debt. Coverage ratios are about interest. Liquidity ratios, can they meet their short-term obligations? All of this is information that we could use as an outside analyst, as a potential investor, and we can use this information as a management of the firm. So now we want to actually see what these calculations are. And again, I won't do them today. We'll do the calculations next week. For today, we'll just learn what they are. We're going to start with liquidity ratios. Right? Liquidity ratios. One of the most common one is called the current ratio. Right? Current ratio. Sorry, your name?
Rich,
Rich.
yes,
Rich, you mentioned net working capital before.
yes.
What is net working capital?
It's, net working capital is assets minus, yeah, it's current assets versus current liabilities.
So working capital, working, finance jargon for what?
What your actual cash on hand is.
Well, cash, but what else? It's not just cash,
Minus
it's
liabilities.
not liability.
AR.
It's short-term. Working is finance code for what do we need to do our daily operations, right? Our short-term assets, and we want to compare them to what Rich said is short-term liabilities. So net working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. That's all it is. And in general, what do you want? You want this number, right? You want current assets
To be bigger.
to be bigger than current liabilities. Because if it is, that means
You got
that
something
you
left
likely will have enough current assets to cover. It doesn't have to be just cash, right? Have enough current assets to cover your current liabilities. You're, from a liquidity perspective, you're okay. At least likely to be. So, net working capital is the difference between current assets and current liabilities. The current ratio, what do you think it's going to be?
Current assets divided by current.
The division, right? The ratio of current assets to current liabilities. What do we want this number to be in general? Larger is better and better, larger than 1, right? 1 to be bigger than 1, and the larger it is, the better. And again, all these numbers, right, once we start, we'll have a whole bunch of ratios here in a few minutes, right? Once we have all these numbers, by themselves they mean nothing. If I told you that this number for a firm was equal to 1.5,
Pop a champagne bottle.
Not terrible.
that tells you very little actually, right? What if the industry average is 3.5? And they're at 1.5. That's not so good. What if it was 3.5, 2.5, 2.0 the last 3 years, and now they're at 1.5? That's not a good trend, right? So any given number by itself doesn't help us much. We need to look at the trend in the numbers, and we need to compare it to the industry average. But first we have to understand conceptually what these ratios are. And oh, by the way, you don't have to memorize them. Okay, at the back of the chapter, there's a page that has all these ratios on it. So you don't have to memorize them, but you do have to know what they are and understand what they're trying to tell us. Right? Not just, divide this number by this number and have no idea what it's talking about. That defeats the purpose. Right? So there's current ratio. There's also something called the quick ratio, which is also called sometimes referred to as the acid test. What is the least liquid of your current assets?
Cash.
Least liquid.
Least-
Cash is your most liquid.
Yeah.
Accounts receivable.
Receivables, I mean, they're less liquid than cash, but what's the other, are they more or less liquid than inventory? Receivables.
Less, more. No, that-
I think receivables, there are firms that will buy receivables, right? You can, you can find a firm that they specialize in buying receivables. Now, they won't give you dollar for dollar, then they say, okay, we'll give you 95 cents for your receivables. But, those firms are out there, you can sell your receivables that way fairly easily. But what if you want to start selling off inventory? It's a little problematic, right? And so inventory is generally considered, again, these are all rules of thumb, right? But inventory is generally considered the least liquid of all of the current assets. So this quick ratio is exactly the same as the current ratio. It's current assets, but we're going to subtract off inventory, more restrictive over current liabilities. Right? If we take away inventory as a current asset, can they still meet their liquidity requirements? If they can, it's a good thing, right? All right. Those are the two primary liquidity ratios. Now, efficiency ratios. I'm glad these are next because they're the most confusing. Efficiency ratios. What do we say they do to us in general? Or help us in general?
and assets and the profits.
Somebody mumbled
Oh,
something.
yeah, I said that, the ability to turn assets into profits.
Right? Ability to turn assets into profits. So we want to measure how we can use our assets and turn them into profits. So that's what our efficient ratios are going to do, right? So these are what you'll hear called turnover ratios, right? Inventory turnover ratios. Now, this textbook actually says that it's cost of goods sold over inventory. Most of the time, you'll see it as sales over inventory. So that's how I'm going to look at it, because I think it makes much more intuitive sense to think of it as sales per inventory than cost of goods sold per inventory. And so I'm going to write this as sales divided by inventory. Now, what is that telling us? Now, what is that ratio telling us?